Football in the late 19th century was very different from today's game. The rules and structure of the sport would be barely recognizable to us now. Contemporary football reflects a few of its original features, but, mostly, only faint echoes remain. Football was a creation of East Coast elite universities in the last half of the 19th century. The first historically acknowledged gridiron clash occurred in 1869. By the early 1870s, football was being played at a new state institution of higher learning in California that had recently adopted the name University of California. Football was a disorderly hybrid of rugby and soccer known as the Boston game in its earliest days. While there was a wide variety of rules, one thing was common. Football was a bruising and bloody contest. Most games followed a handful of alleged standardized rules of 15 to 25 players per side, 40-minute halves, starting a play by heeling out or kicking the ball backward to a teammate, and if some progress was made, even a few inches, a team did not have to yield possession of the round, stubby ball, technically a prolate spheroid. Brick Morris, who was a leader of the Cal football squads of the late 1870s and early 1880s, recalled that, quote, "Play consisted in simply kicking the ball around. Kicks landed approximately 50-50 on the ball and the other fellow's shins. The game was played with no particular rules, no science, no organization of attack, no nothing. Just pull and haul, kick and run, squirm and wiggle until the ball went behind one goal or the other," unquote. In the era when Morse's free-for-all assemblage of what he called the struggling, kicking, clawing heap of bodies, legs, and arms was in vogue, attempts to develop a uniform set of rules were led by a Yale medical student named Walter Camp. Over the next decade, the Camp-led effort led to a general agreement that each team should have only 11 players on the field. A squad would lose possession of the football if they did not gain at least 5 yards, or if it lost more than 10 yards, in 3 plays or downs. Play could be initiated by snapping the ball by hand or kicking out with the foot. Camp's rules led to the quarterback position, stripes on the field, a new scoring system with 2 points for a touchdown, 4 points for what would later be called the point after touchdown, and 5 points for a field goal. 3 points for a field goal became the rule in 1909, and 6 points for a touchdown in 1912. 2 referees were mandated, but reluctantly. The gentlemen athletes were expected to honorably regulate their own games, but skullduggery led to the need for officials. However, the referees were not allowed whistles until 1889 and only rarely called fouls. As James Hopper, a star for the University of California football squad in the 1890s, noted in a 1915 reminiscence, quote, "Unless you tweaked your opponent's nose clear off or walked away with his leg, no whistle was blown," unquote. A tackled player was considered down only when they could no longer move. As Hopper recalled, a ball carrier, when brought to ground, quote, "went on, clawing the earth for a possible half-inch, while the fellows on the other side piled up on you one by one, and your own fellows, trying to help, piled up on you one by one, until the referee, a skeptical fellow, at last became convinced that your progress was truly halted and blew his whistle," unquote. Forward passes were prohibited in the beginning, and in later years there was no tactical advantage to passing, as an incomplete pass could result in a loss of possession. Safety equipment was virtually non-existent and considered unmanly. It was not until the late 1890s that rudimentary helmets began to appear. Prior to that, the players protected their heads from injury by growing their hair long. The occasional teammate might wear a leather nose guard for protection, but that was considered bad form. The rules stipulated that an injured player could not be replaced, so, as James Hopper stated, quote, "The 11 who started the game were held bitterly in it to the very end. The ethical standards of that idealistic period demanded that we stay in the game even if sprained of ankle, twisted of knee, dislocated of shoulder, or goofy in the head," unquote. There was no team doctor because, as Hopper remembered, quote, "physicians were feared. They might over-coddle us or turn us into hypochondriacs," unquote. Instead, the medical needs were provided by the team trainer, who was, as Hopper said, usually an ex-pro wrestler who had turned masseur. He had treasured ideas all his own on physiology and hygiene, unquote. These practices and guidelines led to a wide-open game that featured long runs and many lateral passes like rugby. It also resulted in the widespread use of the vicious play known as the flying wedge. In this maneuver, as James Hopper described, quote, "We left the ball on the ground in charge of the quarterback and strolled back some 30 yards to get a good start. The joke on the defensive team being that it couldn't stir as long as the ball remained on the ground and wasn't put in play. Leisurely, we formed ourselves into a solid V-shaped wedge and got a-going, gradually picking up momentum till we were rumbling along like a juggernaut. At the last, best moment, our quarterback whisked the ball back to us, thus freeing our opponents just as we mightily crushed into them," unquote. It was a devastatingly effective play, almost impossible to stop. Almost. As Hopper explained, there was one way to counteract the flying wedge. He wrote, quote, "Sure, you could stop it. All you had to do was sling yourself very exactly at its precise apex. It then went up in the air and shattered like a house of cards. At least that is what they told you when you woke up 20 minutes later," unquote. By the early 1890s, football became an especially bloody affair as injuries mounted precipitously. The rising tide of serious, even fatal injuries was presaged in an 1887 article in Century magazine entitled, quote, "The American Game of Football," unquote. Author Alexander Johnston wrote that there was increasing criticism that focused on two aspects of the game. Quote, "First, the innate roughness of the game and the likelihood of severe accident or even death from it. And second, its tendency to degenerate into brutality and personal combat, from the personal contact between the players, which is an inevitable feature of it," unquote. In 1893 alone, college football recorded 25 deaths and innumerable serious injuries. In 1894, anti-momentum rules were adopted that banned the full application of the flying wedge, but wedge blocking continued in a modified form until 2009. Nonetheless, violence in football was ordinary. In 1894, the Los Angeles Herald reported that it had become so commonplace that people served notice that they would, quote, "not allow any of the players to act like a lot of prize fighters and publicly maim each other for life. The game will be stopped at the first exhibition of brutality. If the players are brutal, they are lawbreakers and therefore amenable to arrest," unquote. As injuries mounted, some colleges eliminated their football programs, and a handful called for abolition of the game. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt called for reducing or eliminating injuries, and later that year, 62 representatives from football schools gathered to adopt new rules to make football safer. But the sport would never become completely injury-free, as the recent concerns over football-related concussions attest. While attempts to make the game less dangerous occurred, the aggressive attitude of football was not questioned and was celebrated as a reflection of turn-of-the-century masculine and societal virtues. Cal football star James Hopper explained the mindset, quote, "Our idea was to hammer, hammer, and hammer. You hammered a chosen spot of the other side till it was a bit pulpy, and then you hammered it some more," unquote.